Saville. He's the chief strategist at Citadel. I don't know what the difference is, Adrian. Maybe you can educate us between the two and maybe give us a sense of what's the difference between fragility and fracturedness.
To suggest that the rand is fragile says that it can get put into sort of recovery mode, that with a bit of TLC, some love and affection, the rand will recover. Fractured, by contrast, says that it's broken. And if you think of the narrative at different junctures through late last year, certainly through some parts of this year, there's been a constant anchoring or referencing back to, well, just how much trouble the country is in, and by inference, how much trouble the currency is in. And think no further than that 1792 moment in January of this year.
Now, there's a very interesting study that you have been involved in, and in the study you identify the key drivers that are going to determine whether we go towards fragility or whether we go towards a fractured state. Talk us through some of those findings, and we'll pull up the image so that the viewer can keep track of the conversation too.
Sure. I think it's just worth making the comment that one of the things that motivates this study was the recognition that very often when people are commenting on markets, currencies, there is a huge amount of sort of in-the-moment observation and a lot of emotion that guides views and informs decisions. And what the study does is it affords an opportunity to step back and use objective measures to get out of the business of I think, I feel, to I observe. And to establish factors that matter, we survey a number of countries over multiple decades, and in all instances, the question that we're asking is, what are the things that seem to matter in influencing, in guiding, in shaping the currency performance in the event of economic crisis or fragility, to be less dramatic. And our final analysis, we settled on 10 factors, which we put into 3 bins. And the 3 bins can essentially be characterized as follows. In the first bin, the question is this country reliant on external exposure? The easiest example is a commodity-based country.
Right.
The second bin says, regardless of whether the country is commodity-based, is it well managed, or is the management of the economy, does it leave something open to be desired?
Right, so these are the policies in essence.
So the second bin is policies, and macroeconomic policy and the institutions that sit behind that policy. So an example of the first economy, which would be commodity-reliant and well-managed, Chile would be a good example. An example of a commodity-reliant economy that's not so well managed, well, Brazil would be a good example. And then the third silo, in the third bin, the question that we posed there was to, or the aspect that we interrogated there was to recognize that regardless of how open or closed you are, and regardless of how good or bad your macroeconomic management is, all economies, all countries have misfortune, misstep from time to time. And if that's the fact, then the question is, well, do you have the means to withstand a mistake if you fumble? And so that third silo, what we set out to measure was the capability of the economy to withstand missteps.
I think I just want to ask you 2 questions. Obviously, you said that, we give the example of Chile and Brazil. Where are we as South Africa? Are we close to an economy that depends too much on commodities but well managed? That's number one. Then the second point, I think, for the viewers as well, you do have those numbers there, the ratios. What do they mean?
Sure. As in many economic discussions, there's no such thing as a simple answer or a one-handed answer. So in the first silo, where we look at is the country open and is it reliant on external sector, I think we have to recognize that openness can be very dysfunctional and heavily reliant, where you're simply selling a commodity to a foreign client, or openness can be very functional, in which you're a strong, competitive, export-oriented economy with growing market share, South Korea. Where South Africa scores in that first column is fair. That's not so much a score as opposed to an observation. The economy is reasonably open. We import and export about 1/3 of our activity. We're not nearly as primary sector reliant as many people would imagine.
Right.
And the way to interpret these scores is to see 1 as being the best possible number you could achieve, and the bottom number is the number of countries for which we have reliable, robust data.
So government debt to GDP, just looking at that first column, we are ranking 30th out of 72
Correct.
countries, and the number of countries will vary. So you get different nuances out of each reading.
Yeah, so on every single factor, the question is how many countries do we have sufficient reliable data? Economic openness, 185 countries. How does South Africa rank? 47. So that would say South Africa is not nearly as vulnerable to external impact as a sort of common observation would suggest. When it comes to the current account deficit, we sit at 106. This is not a good score.
Adrian, so what would be the now what of this analysis? Because if we take a look at these various scores, their various ratios, what would be the advisory that you would give to an investor or a business operating in South Africa, which is exposed, of course, to currency fluctuation?
When you're dealing with the rand, you're dealing with heavily traded currency that is influenced most often by sentiment rather than reality. What this does is it tries to put reality in place of sentiment, and it allows us to make the observation that when we rank South Africa on these 10 different elements, the score that we achieve is we rank halfway, which means to suggest that South Africa sits on top of a broken currency is a very bold statement that doesn't really take into account the structural strength and fabric of the economy. But by the same token, to anticipate a spectacular recovery in the currency is also probably naive, because we're only scoring halfway in terms of the different factors.
And unfortunately, we've come to the end of this conversation. I know Joseph still had quite a number of questions. A big thank you to Dr. Adrian Saville, Chief Strategist at Citadel, and this as he jets off to the World Bank. And a very big thank you to Joseph Busher, who's also the head of JM Busher Investments. Let's take a short break, but when we come back, we're picking up on the story of the government of Equatorial Guinea,